Welcome back to The Truth Perspective, everyone. I am your host, Harrison Cayley, and joining me is Corey Schenk.
Nice to be back.
Today we are pleased to be joined by Gordon Hahn. Gordon is an author and analyst who has worked for various DC think tanks over the years, and his website is gordonhahn.com, where he writes about Eurasian geopolitics, Russia, also Ukraine, Syria, U.S. politics, everything that kind of relates to that milieu. He's written 3 books so far. The first is Russia's Revolution from Above, Reform, Transition, and Revolution in the Fall of the Soviet Communist Regime, followed by Russia's Islamic Threat, and the Caucasus Emirate Mujahideen, Global Jihadism in Russia's North Caucasus and beyond. He has a new book coming out later this year called Ukraine Over the Edge, Russia, the West, and the Making of the Ukrainian Crisis and New Cold War. So, Gordon, welcome to the show. To start out with, could you tell us a bit about the 3 books that you've written, or the 4 books that you've written, and about your background and how you came to write them?
1 year in the early 90s before the Soviet Union collapsed. And so my first book basically grew out of my dissertation, which was a study of Gorbachev's conflict with the Communist Party apparatus as he tried to implement reforms. So that was Russia's Revolution from Above, which was published in 2002. And then I kicked around a few think tanks. I worked at the St. Petersburg State University on a Fulbright fellowship for a year. I came back to the States and decided one of the easiest ways to continue employment in this difficult field was because it was, it was 2003, 2004, was relatively shortly after 9/11, and the big topic in the United States was jihadism or terrorism. Mm-hmm. And also right around that time, 2004, there was a major attack in Moscow on the subway. And I was in Moscow at the time. And so I decided to look into this whole question of whether there were jihadis in the North Caucasus or whether they were actually national freedom fighters, mm-hmm. And so forth and so on. And so out of that grew my book, Russia's Islamic Threat. And then I basically continued on looking at the North Caucasus jihadism and global jihadism. And that led to Caucasus Emirate Mujahideen as the basically as a follow-up of the previous book, in which basically all the findings in Caucasus Mujahideen confirmed that the previous book had been basically correct about predicting that and showing that at the time even already the jihadis had sunk their teeth into the Chechen Republic of Ichkeria, as it was once called. About half the movement was already jihadist, more than national separatist. And that's basically it. And then once the Ukraine crisis broke out, one thing that I discovered when I was working on the 2 books on Islamism, as Russia's Islamic Threat and Caucasus Emirate Mujahideen, is that there was an awful lot of bias and distortion in the Western media about what was going on. Complete failure and even, I would say, deliberate distortion, disinformation, what now everybody calls fake news, about what was going on in North Caucasus. Mm-hmm. And so that made me just a little suspicious when I was hearing all the news agencies reporting the same version of what was going on in Ukraine without any nuance whatsoever. And I began to I was following as it was going on, so I was also seeing some disconnect in between the facts on the ground at the time and the reporting. And the more I looked into it, I realized that there's certainly a book here, and that the version that the American people were getting from the mass media was a distortion of the facts about what was going on in Ukraine. And the record needed to be corrected, so I decided to write the book on Ukraine.
Well, as everybody knows, in St. Petersburg, there were terror attacks a few weeks ago. And like you said, there in the Caucasus, there hasn't really been a very objective assessment of what the Russian Islamic threat really looks like. But you really dive into it into your book. So I was wondering, could you explain for us who aren't aware of what Russia's Islamic threat really looks like, why it is that you predicted this rise in Islamic extremism in Russia.
Well, it goes back, basically we need to go back to the mid-90s and look at the history. So initially, it's true that the initial movement, the formation of the Chechen Republic of Czechia as the Soviet Union was falling apart, was a national separatist movement. It was inspired by, many things, the long history of North Caucasus resistance to Russian rule, dating back to the original conquest by the Russians, the fact that there had been national movements in the Union republics, that is, in places like the Baltics and Georgia, somewhat less strong in Ukraine and other places. And so initially it was a national separatist movement. It was not a democratic movement. So there's one particular author who covers the North Caucasus who at one point wrote that something along the lines of he's seen quite often North Caucasus militants writing about George Washington. That George Washington is mentioned more in their literature than Osama bin Laden. I don't know what literature he's reading from the Caucasus Mujahideen or the Chechen Republic of Czechia, but I've never seen George Washington's name mentioned once. And my guess is if he was mentioned, he wouldn't have been mentioned in a very positive light. So, whereas I've seen lots of stuff from bin Laden and all the other jihadists on their website. So anyway, by 1997, a guy by the name of Hattab, who was a close associate of bin Laden, for example, when he was killed, when Hattab was killed, bin Laden wrote a eulogy for him. He came to the North Caucasus, and he became friendly with Shamil Basayev. By the way, Basayev had been in Afghanistan to the al-Qaeda training camps in 1994, but his whole conglomerate of about 30 or 40 mujahideen who had been actually fighting on the side of the ethnic Abkhaz in their battle to separate from Georgia at the time. And they actually had received, at least Basayev allegedly had received some training from the Russian GRU. That doesn't make him an agent of the Russian security forces by any means. He then went to Afghanistan, he trained, they all got sick on something and they left. So they never actually received any training as far as people can tell. But this shows a desire to become part of the jihad. Anyway, by 1997, Basayev and Hattab began to set up camps, training camps, not just for the jihad in Russia, but for training camps, training jihadists to carry out attacks in the West and other places. I cited a whole bunch of, in the second book, second book on Islamism, the Caucasus and Mujahideen, court cases from the United States in which it's documented in the brief when they closed down certain benevolent foundations that were supporting jihad around the world that were based in the United States, that a large chunk of the money they were raising was going to the Chechen Republic of Czechia, the so-called national separatist movement. And the rest of it was going to Afghanistan. So that shows that the Chechen Republic of Czechia had a high priority among global jihadists at the time. Anyway, they began to gradually, this was, by the way, 1997 now, we're already getting into the interwar period. So the first Chechen war has ended, and in the interwar period in Chechnya, there was absolute chaos. People were kidnapping people for ransom, and it was just absolute chaos. There was a struggle for power within the Chechen Republic of Czechia. There were various groupings. One of the groupings was the jihadist group of Basayev and Hattab. So by 1998, they began to, they had built up, a certain critical mass of jihadi fighters, maybe 1,000 or so, who were willing to fight under the wing of Basayev and Hattab. And they decided they created a Congress of the Dagestani and Chechen peoples, which was an indication that they were planning to spread the jihad to the Republic of Dagestan, which is next to Chechnya and is the most important republic in the North Caucasus by sheer numbers and by the legacy of Islam. It goes back much longer in Dagestan than it does in Chechnya and other places in North Caucasus. So to move along a little quicker, by July 1999, these forces, you can actually find the video on the internet of about 1,000 to 2,000 fighters crossing the border from Chechnya into Dagestan, and the Russians eventually rallied the Dagestani peoples. Many of the Dagestani nationalities don't particularly like Chechens. and they don't particularly, at the time, they weren't particularly receptive to Islamism or jihadism, and they managed to fight back this invasion. It was shortly about a month later that we had those so-called apartment bombings in Moscow and Rostov-na-Donu, and often that is portrayed as some kind of a plot involving Putin to garner additional support for his presidential campaign and so forth. And my question, one question has always been, is if the Chechens with jihadis had just invaded Dagestan, why would you need to blow up apartment bombings to gain support?
Yeah,
Right? You have all the reason in the world to to carry out a battle in Chechnya against these jihadis. Why do you need to risk an operation like that, blowing up 300 of your own people in central Moscow and so forth to do that? My own theory on that is that actually Berezovsky was behind that attack, and it was a way to, he thought maybe either curry favor or entrap Putin into a situation, because remember, at this point, Putin had just come to power. He hadn't even been elected president yet. Mm-hmm. He was only acting prime minister. So he did not have a large support base. Even within the FSB, where he came from, as analysts endlessly report, he was not a major figure in the FSB and the KGB by any stretch of the imagination, except for the brief period when he headed the FSB for about a year from 98 to 99. But other than that, and that was basically a fluke. I mean, he was not someone who originally was a high-ranking FSB officer. He was a mid-ranking officer in Germany when the wall came down and everything collapsed. So this basically kicks off the second so-called Chechen War. And once the Chechen forces of the Chechen Republic of Ichkeria are completely routed by basically 2001, it takes about almost a full year for elements to get back together in the mountains of Chechnya. And those elements are basically the jihadi elements, and they come to basically a compromise, the jihadis and the national separatists. And that compromise basically consists of Aslan Masarov remaining president, but promising that eventually they're going to switch to an all-out jihadist organization. And he agrees that from now on, any decision that he takes and any interpretation of the Chechen Republic of Ichkeria constitution has to be consistent with Sharia law. And they create a committee headed by another jihadi who then succeeds Masarov, Sadulayev, and he is the one who basically decides if Masarov's decisions are consistent with Sharia law. So at this point, you can basically say that the jihadists, at a minimum, consist of about half of the movement and are basically gaining the upper hand within the leadership. Mm-hmm. At a minimum, we have a 50-50 compromise, right? And then over the period of 2002 to 2007, there's a battle, right, to actually follow through on this plan to switch to a full-fledged jihadi organization. And this is reflected in debates on their websites. And by 2006, Basayev is announcing that in January, I believe it was 2006, in summer 2006, we're going to conduct a meeting of the Council of Ulema, and we're going to announce decision about creating a jihadi formation. But Basayev is killed in June, I believe it was, or July 2006. Sadulayev, then Masarov basically is forced to concede. Masarov was killed at some point. I forget when exactly he was killed now. I have to go back and look. I already forgot. I haven't looked at stuff in so long. And basically, Umarov takes over. Umarov was the Doku Umarov, later called Abu Usman, was a high-ranking mujahid, to be sure, but, he wasn't, you could say he was in the top inner circle of maybe top 10, 15 mujahideen. And he takes over, and he, in October 2007, then declares the Caucasus Emirate. And there's a split complete. He basically shuts down the Chechen Republic of Ichkeria operation. He breaks off all ties with people like Akhmedov in London, who was then the foreign minister of the Chechen Republic of Ichkeria. Many of the people who were leading forces in the Chechen Republic of Ichkeria fled abroad after the defeat in the Second War. And so basically, many of the national separatists are now abroad, and those who have remained are the real hardcore fighters, the more radical ones, the more determined ones, and of course they're more susceptible to a radical ideology, especially after being routed in the battlefield in 2002. And we all know that the Russian military forces are not the most gentle. They go out there killing, so that also is a factor, to be sure. So by 2007 now you have the Caucasus Emirate. And then we see a gradual increase in the number of jihadi attacks leading from 2008. One way to trace that is looking at the number of suicide bombings, so that by 2011, I believe it was, you had 16 suicide bombings, where previously you never had more than, well, you had about 14 in 2010, 8, I believe, in 2009, if I'm not mistaken. I have to go back and look at the numbers. But back in 2008 and 2007 and 2006, you weren't talking more than one maximum per year. So you're talking about a large number of suicide bombings occurring in not just the North Caucasus, but in Russia and so forth, from 2007 to 2012. Then the Civil War breaks out, and I'm going through this in a very superficial way, but then the Civil War breaks out in Syria, and large because the jihad is not overwhelmingly successful in the North Caucasus, although by 2011 was a sort of peak when there were, I think, 600, 700 attacks, and as I said earlier, 16 and 14 suicide bombings. I have to go back again and look at numbers. But still, the prospects of carrying out real jihad and getting real fighting experience on a real battlefield, not carrying out basically guerrilla operations and hit-and-run operations, but real battlefield experience, and also just getting access to the training that might be afforded by Al-Qaeda at the time, many of the mujahideen began to leave and go to Syria. And this was reflected in a sharp fall in the number of attacks in 2012, another fall in 2013, another in 2014. And by 2013, 2014, you had hundreds of North Caucasus fighters fighting in Syria in various groups. In most of the groups, often there were groups of foreign fighters, and in most of the groups, a Chechen or a Dagestani was the emir, that is the leader of the group. Mm-hmm. And the most famous of all was Hahn Batirashvili, who was a ethnic Chechen Kis, which is basically an ethnic Chechen from the Georgian valley of Pankisi Gorge in Georgia. And he went to fight with one of these groups in Syria, and then he switched over to the Islamic State. And he became the leader of the Northern Front for the Islamic State, straddling Syria and Iraq, mostly in Syria. Around Idlib, by the way, where the recent chemical attack occurred. And they were very prominent in this region. So by 2014, you had large numbers of North Caucasus fighters and other fighters from Russia, Muslim fighters, Tatars, Bashkirs, also people from Central Asia, and often these people were in one group. So this meant that now I skipped over the fact also earlier that ideologically, long before, in 2007, the Caucasus Emirate was ideologically compatible entirely with Al-Qaeda. And in fact, with another teacher who supported Al-Qaeda, Abu Asem al-Maqdisi, who, according to one of the leading research centers at West Point on global jihadism, they characterized around 2012, 2013 as the most influential jihadi theologist and philosopher in the world, more influential than bin Laden. And he in 2009 endorsed the Caucasus Emirate as a legitimate jihadi organization. He developed a close relation with the leading theo-ideologist of the Caucasus Emirate, a guy by an ethnic Kabard, who was the Qadi of the Sharia court, the judge of the Sharia court of the Caucasus Emirate. And so ideologically there was this compatibility. So this is why you had these groups go to Syria, and many of them now come in direct contact with elements tied to Al-Qaeda, with groups like there were many of these groups that the Chechens were emirs of were fighting under Al-Nusra, the Al-Nusra Front, which is an Al-Qaeda affiliate. Then you have the rise of the Islamic State. As I mentioned earlier, Hahn Batirashvili went over to the Islamic State. So now you have a battle inside the North Caucasus about which group we're going to, under whose wing we're going to go. We're going to go under the wing of the Islamic State, who just declared a caliphate, or are we going to stay with the, flagging operation called Al-Qaeda, who hasn't pulled pulled off a major attack in a long time. They don't have a caliphate. They don't have some 30,000 fighters by that time, right? And so a battle begins to emerge within the Caucasus Emirate about which side to join. And eventually, again, to make a long story short, with the death of Doku Umarov on the eve of the, actually about 5 months before the Sochi Olympics, and the replacement of a new emir, Dagestani, which was inevitable given the Dagestani's preeminence in the North Caucasus, that a Chechen would be replaced by a Dagestani at this time. Dagestani is then killed. His successor is then killed, a guy by the name of Gimravi from Gimri in Dagestan, also Dagestani. And as a result, the majority of the Mujahideen see that the operation is not going very well, and they decide to declare their loyalty in 2015, late 2015, I believe, early 2016. Again, the dates are escaping me. Their loyalty to the Islamic State. And they declare the bayat, the loyalty oath to al-Baghdadi. And basically, from what I can tell, initially there was maybe 10 to 20% who appeared to remain with the Caucasus Emirate and support al-Qaeda. But the bulk of the emirs from Chechnya and Dagestan and even North Kabardino-Balkaria and Ingushetia, they all followed Amir al-Sildarov, who just was killed last December, to the Islamic State. And by now, you have very few Mujahideen in the North Caucasus who are fighting under the banner of the Caucasus Emirate, if there are any at all. Those who are fighting under the banner of the Caucasus Emirate are fighting in Syria. And there are still several groups who still fly the flag of the Caucasus Emirate, one group called the Caucasus Emirate in Syria. But the bulk of those who are located in the North Caucasus are loyal to the Islamic State.
So it sounds like the majority of kind of the, would you say that the most radical elements are the ones that went to Syria? Because there are still obviously a lot of problems in, or let's say a lot of radical jihadis that are still in the Caucasus region and still in Russia, and all over, in different various regions of Russia. So how would you kind of categorize the ones that are still there, or are they kind of like in Europe? There's the in the news you hear a lot about the threat of the returnees or migrants coming into Europe and staging terror attacks. Are we seeing something similar in Russia, or is it more of still a homegrown thing, or both?
Yes. Well, it hasn't really been a homegrown. The homegrown whole thing is exaggerated, as mentioned earlier, because a lot of this had to do with the Al-Qaeda influence. So even though, fighters may have been fighting because they don't like, in part, or initially, if they were with the Chechen Republic Ichkeria, because they didn't like the Russian regime, they wanted to be independent. Over time, they began to switch to a purely religious motivation. Mm-hmm. So the first question you have to have, basically, it's true that most of the, it's logical, right, that the more radical, the fighters, the guys who really wanted to fight, those are the ones who went to Syria, right? Mm-hmm. And they've been there for a while. Many of them have been killed. Many of those who went, initially in 2012 have been killed. And I would imagine many of those who were there in 2013 and 2014 were killed. So, you don't survive there very long. Mm-hmm. But certainly with the route, the key here is that with the route, or the ongoing route, or apparent route of the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, a lot of these fighters, in fact, Baghdadi gave an order that they should begin to disperse and go back home. So there's no doubt that we should begin to see some of these guys traversing, Azerbaijan, and we very likely would see something happen there as well, not just in Turkey, but in Azerbaijan, on their way back home to the North Caucasus, or in some cases to Tatarstan. The Russian security services over the last year and a half have claimed to arrest quite a few people who have fought in Syria and Iraq. Probably some of those are exaggerations. In some cases it's real, in some cases it's not. It's a way just to throw in an extra charge on somebody you don't like. But certainly there are some that are returning, some are being arrested, some are not. The St. Petersburg attack was more someone who appears to have been simply a lone wolf. But even the lone wolves, people like, the Zainab brothers who blew up Boston, the Boston Massacre, these are people who, again, we're talking about sort of a virtual movement in many ways that's on the internet, right? And many people are inspired by these guys, and that's, a pattern, a global pattern. In fact, the Caucasus, the people from the Chechen Republic of Ichkeria became the Caucasus Emirate specifically because they were under the influence of the propaganda of Al-Qaeda, which they largely got from the internet. Mm-hmm. So if a whole organization is transforming its ideology under the influence of the web, we can expect that many individuals will. In terms of how many radicals are in Russia now, in the North Caucasus, again, I don't think, independent of the Islamic State loyal Mujahideen, there aren't many. There's a larger Islamist movement, that is a movement of people who believe that you can bring Sharia law to the region or to all of Russia, but by peaceful means, right? Mm-hmm. So that's a different orientation, and that's been developing in Dagestan quite a bit. And in fact, one of the cousins of the Tsarnaev brothers was a figure in that movement. In fact, tried to talk Tamerlan out of carrying out the attack and joining. He went originally to the north to Dagestan to join the Caucasus Arab Mujahideen. He tried to talk him out of it, and he succeeded. And he went back home and blew up Boston, so to speak.
Well, this, like the kind of dynamic that you're describing, it reminds me, and maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, but it kind of reminds me of the original Russian Revolution, 1917, and the Bolsheviks, and how you have a movement, like a revolutionary movement, that has a certain ideology, and you've got so-called moderates and so-called radicals, and it seems to be like there's almost, it seems to me like it's almost a, forgive the term, historical necessity, that when you have a movement like this, that the most radical elements are the ones that end up in charge, basically. So you had the Bolsheviks take over, and with various purges and the Gulag system, you had any kind of even internal opposition just stamped out. And the original, so-called, just good-hearted communists who just thought it was a good system were just railroaded and pushed over. And so it seems like there's a similar thing in the so-called Islamist movement, where, well, at least that's the way I'm seeing it right now, because there's an organization called Hizb ut-Tahrir, I think it's called, and it's one of those ones that's banned in Russia, and they are they're a vocally Islamist movement, but non-violent. So they think that that they'll be able to establish an Islamic State through non-violent means, and it'll be this great kind of utopian system. But I found some of these guys online and watched their YouTube channels, and I can't remember the one guy's name, but he's got various talks that he's given, and he's giving interviews, and it's all about the Syrian Revolution. And so these guys, they're interviewing each other and talking about the Syrian Revolution and how they support the Free Syrian Army and how al-Nusra is doing good work in the Syrian Revolution, and it's just horrible, these neoliberal policies that are trying to stamp out the revolution. And this is coming from a group that says they're nonviolent, and it seems like it's just, well, it looks like it would be even the nonviolent Islamists are heading for a disaster if they think that they can avoid the kind of really extreme ideology that you see in Caucasus Emirate and the Islamic State. Do you have anything to comment about that?
Yeah, I mean, it is very similar. The international aspect of the movement, the utopian nature of the movement, the ideological nature of the movement. There's this split between radicals and moderates, and the tendency for the radicals to have more success in recruiting and so forth. You basically look at, the Bolsheviks, for example, did not really engage in terror. It was the Socialist Revolutionary Party that was engaged more in terror during the Russian Revolution. And the Bolsheviks, although they were very radical ideologically, no less radical than the Socialist Revolutionaries, in fact, more radical ideologically than the Socialist Revolutionaries, one could argue anyway. In terms of tactics, they were less radical. So basically the Socialist Revolutionaries were the most popular party after the and even leading up to the abdication and the fall of the Romanov dynasty and so forth and so on, with the Bolsheviks actually being less popular. But the Bolsheviks had one advantage in that they were better organized, because they didn't need to be quite so secretive, because they weren't engaged in terror.
Mm-hmm.
So that was one advantage. Although they were willing to carry out violence, but they were more willing to carry out violence once they took power rather than to get to power. So there are very, very many, yes, similarities. Another similarity is this whole the inevitability, right? That history is on our side. You know, in the Bolshevik or the communist case, it was due to this interpretation of dialectical materialism and the path of history going from feudalism to capitalism, and so it was inevitable sooner or later. In the case of jihadism, it's because Allah wills this, so that sooner or later there will be this. And if you look at the ISIS ideology, which believes that there's going to be a special conflict in an area near Syria, and that's going to bring all the armies of the, for lack of a better word, Satan to the region, and there's going to be a big conflagration, and that's going to bring the global. That's going to bring the Mahdi, and then they're going to have basically a global rule of Islam. It's very similar in that sense.
Well, the focus of the three books that you've got out right now, and the fourth one, we were just talking a little bit about the show. It seems like there's a theme that has run through all of them, and that is just revolution, regime change of some sort. Because the first book was Russia's Revolution from Above. So, well, we can get into that a bit, but just to kind of preface it, like the way you basically are describing the global jihad movement is a revolutionary movement. So maybe just to get into some of the kind of theory behind that, maybe you can just describe why it's a revolutionary movement and what a revolution or revolutionary movement actually is.
Right. Well, the standard definition of a revolutionary movement is a illegal, basically, or anti-constitutional movement, the standard definition. From below, in society that seeks to overthrow the order and create a new social order, new political order, new socioeconomic order, a new political order. And that can be done through a peaceful revolution from below or a violent revolution from below. It doesn't have to be necessarily violent. So essentially, the jihadi movement fits the model no less than the communist movement that we were discussing earlier, right? They want to overthrow all secular regimes and establish Islamist regimes, Sharia law-based regimes. And that implies certain things about how the economy will be run, although a lot of these things aren't very well worked out. Just as, by the way, the communists didn't have a very well worked out scheme about how government was to be function. They had a slogan, the dictatorship of the proletarian, but how was that to be structured, and how would they actually manage the society at all different levels? That wasn't very well worked out.
We'll figure that out when we get there.
Right, exactly. And basically, you see, there's a very similar problem in the jihadist movement. And so once these people take power, there'll be a power struggle between all the different factions about how we're supposed to design this the new Soviet man, or in this case, the new jihadi man, the new Islamist man. So, in this sense, there's no doubt that it's a revolutionary movement, and quite often the literature is always focused on the tactic of terrorism, rather than the fact that this is a global revolutionary movement, with the added advantage of having the internet, which the Bolsheviks and the communists didn't have.
Well, if you look on RT, their RT Twitter is doing a 100th anniversary of the revolution thing, where all the guys, Lenin and the Tsar, they all have Twitter accounts, so they're tweeting their way through the revolution. So you can you can see what it would have looked like. Well, kind of. But what was I going to say? So we're talking about this, about the jihadis as a revolutionary movement. Yeah, that's right. So so when you look at, for example, communism, the communist ideology as a revolutionary movement, I mean, communists, at one point, there were communist or communist-inspired governments covering like 60% of the global landmass, and so this seems to be like the same kind of goal or ideology that these jihadi movements have, But like in your books, you talk about something called complex causality and basically what leads to a revolution and why revolutions actually succeed or fail. So maybe before we get into some of those specifics, when you look at the jihadi revolution and their actual ultimate goals, which essentially is, world domination, how plausible is that? Are they, because they've got these dreams of taking over every country. Well, is that even possible? Could they even conquer a non-Muslim majority country or a nation that only has a tiny, Muslim population? And then, do they even think that through, or is something like that possible? Like maybe, I just don't know enough about history, and there's, cases of, these minorities just, taking over, the entire world,
You just mentioned it. You just mentioned the communist movement, right? If you read, it's interesting to read Solzhenitsyn describing Lenin in Zurich in 1914, and here's this guy giving lectures to like 5 or 6, radical communists in Zurich, where there's no prospect whatsoever of communists ever coming to power, and the next thing you know, 4 years later, he's ruling Russia. So it depends. To some extent, they need chaos. They need something like a world war, right?
Yeah.
World War I is basically what facilitated the Bolsheviks coming to power, right? The Bolsheviks were able to use the German support against the Russian Tsarist regime. One can imagine similar things happening. I'm not making the same analogy, but if you look, for example, not making this a direct analogy, but if you look, for example, at the support that the Obama administration gave through Libya to the Syrian rebels, not taking into account the fact that a large portion of the Syrian rebels were either Muslim Brotherhood or jihadists. Multiply that, put that on, extrapolate that onto a world war scale scenario, right? Where there's utter chaos, regimes are falling all over the place because of the war and the instability it's caused and the economic dislocation and so forth and so on. One can easily imagine one or more parties deciding to support a jihadist group or an Islamist group or a combined revolutionary front organization that involves, because often another point about revolutions is revolutions are usually made, at least the destruction of the regime, of the old regime, are made by coalitions of wide-ranging ideological orientations. All the way, if you look at the Russian Revolution, all the way from liberal Democrats like the Constitutional Party to groups willing to engage in terrorism like the Socialist Revolutionaries, to the Bolsheviks, to the Mensheviks. So one can imagine a coalition of the Muslim Brotherhood, Hizb ut-Tahrir, maybe a group affiliated with Al-Qaeda who's willing to carry out terrorism, and Hizb ut-Tahrir and Muslim Brotherhood are willing to tolerate that because it's an effective tactic. They don't want to engage it. They don't want to dirty their hands, but they're willing to tolerate it and use it to their advantage. And maybe a socialist group here thrown in, or who knows what. And one or more powers decide to support this coalition in some country, say in Egypt or, Saudi Arabia or somewhere, and then they come to power. And they get their hands on resources. And they're able to build a new regime. It's certainly within the realm of possibility. It's just a matter of whether circumstances will facilitate it, whether they have good leadership, whether they have a convincing propaganda narrative, if they have, again, resources and the opportunity, right? Which means, a weak state or a weak regime in which they're located, which they can use all these instruments they have to overthrow, topple. So, yeah, I don't think it's out of the question at all. It's a matter of time and the right circumstances. It's not something that's imminent, but depending on how things go on an international level, and this is why I've been trying to push the idea of cooperation between the West and Russia and even China in the global jihad. Because if we could ally with Stalin against the Nazis in World War II, I don't see why we can't ally with the Chinese and the Russians to fight the jihadists. For me, it's a no-brainer.
No, that's a really great point. I I just wanted to touch on you brought up the topic of ideology a number of times, and I was wondering if you could describe, different revolutionary movements have been associated with major ideological changes, like the Communist Manifesto or the rise of liberalism, the spread of democracies, and I was wondering if you could touch on why now we're seeing this Islamic State spreading, what it is that is in this Islamic ideology that is fomenting these kind of revolutionary conditions, or using these grievances that people have around the world and kind of weaponizing them into revolutionaries.
Right. Well, I mean, you have a situation across the Muslim world, not just in the Muslim world, but mostly in the Muslim world, where you have a large portion of the population that's destitute. There are already partially inclined to buy Islamist arguments because they're adherents of the Islamic religions. That's not to say that all Muslims are jihadists or Islamists, but it does mean that many, many Muslims are potential jihadis or Islamists, just like many Russian citizens during World War I were potential socialists and were socialists, right?
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Because they were living in a country where there were serious social problems. The regime did not want to address them. And there was an ideology that appeared to answer those questions, to solve those problems, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right? The socialist ideology, the communist ideology, was promising economic equality, was diagnosing why people didn't have economic equality. We're going to argue, I'm no Marxist by any sense. I'm a capitalist. But the argument for people, and remember, the other thing is, many people in Russia were either illiterate or borderline illiterate, or had just become literate and had just come to a big city, just come to a university. You see a similar pattern going on in the Muslim world, where you have a certain level of modernization in certain places. So people are coming from the villages into the city. They're seeing a new life. They're being introduced to new ideas, and so forth and so on. At the same, and some of those ideas are pro-democracy ideas. Some of those ideas may be socialist, and one of the contending ideologies is Islamism, and the subcategory jihadism. And so you combine this sort of economic dislocation, this poverty, the harshness of many of the regimes in the region, the weakness in some cases of certain states. For example, the Iraqi state turned out to be relatively weak and quickly crumbled, although it had a strong man like Saddam and seemed to be a strong state. In fact, it was not. And then you combine that with an ideology that seems to provide an answer that is already compatible with a set of ideas that these people have, right? They're already Muslims, so why not simply reinterpret your Islam if this reinterpretation offers an answer to all your problems and the problems of your society?
Mm-hmm.
So it's really not surprising at all. It's not any more surprising than what happened in Russia in 100 years ago.
Well, ideology is one of the points you bring up in your book, The Caucasus Emirate Mujahideen, as one of these kind of causal factors that go into revolution. Maybe I want to kind of step back a bit and look at the kind of theory that we can then apply to all these particulars, and that is kind of the conditions that go into a revolutionary situation or a revolutionary crisis, and then the possible ways that can go. Because we've mentioned a couple, or you mentioned like the possibility of a revolution from below, and then we also mentioned a revolution from above, but we didn't really get into what that means yet. But then there's also transitions. So you have pacted transitions or imposed transitions. Maybe can you just walk us through that flow chart and
decades of research.
Yeah. And so well, to start out with, what would be the preconditions, so the conditions that create a revolutionary situation on the ground? And I know you mentioned a couple of them, but just rattle them off.
Yeah. Well, they're two separate things, right? What creates a revolutionary situation, and then the four types of possible regime change, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, the two issues are related. So basically, what I tried to do initially was, at the time when I started writing the book and my dissertation, the popular field of study in post-Soviet studies and in democracy studies, of course, was the so-called transitology, or transition. And they basically posited things like the idea of a pacted transition in which you would have elements from the regime and opposition negotiate the creation of a new form of rule, right? Mm-hmm. An imposed transition in which you have basically the regime deciding, either because they've diagnosed the situation, they see that a few years down the road there's going to be a revolution, or they've come to the conclusion that the way they're ruling is improper, ineffective, or some other reason not worth continuing pursuing, and they decide by themselves, with minimal pressure from the streets, from the opposition, to begin a transition. So you had a similar case, that was a case that, for example, in Mexico in the 1990s and early 2000s, basically when the PRI over time allowed the opposition parties to win state elections and eventually let them win national elections. Then you have revolutionary change, right? And the most, again, the classic case is the revolution from above. The difference between a transition and a revolution, simply the major difference is that there are several differences, but one of the major differences is that in revolutions, the process is largely illegal and aconstitutional or anti-constitutional or extra-constitutional, right? In the case of a pacted transition, right, you have a set of institutions, and using those institutions, the opposition and the regime change the regime. In the case of an imposed transition, again, the ruling groups use the existing political system to enact a series of laws or change their practice in terms of, say, Mexico, cheating less in elections and so forth and so on, in order to allow the opposition to come to power. In revolutions, it's an illegal process, right? If it's a revolution from below, then what happens is you have groups in society who organize and seize power, overthrow the old regime, and establish a new order from below. If it's a revolution from above, then what happens is groups within state organizations or state institutions engage in some sort of illegal takeover in order to change the form of rule. Mm-hmm. So those are the basic four different types. And then what I tried to do is unite the two fields of study. There was the field of transitology. There was a separate field of people who studied revolution. And when I looked at the two processes, I noticed that up to a certain point, they are very much in common, right? They're usually caused by some kind of economic dislocation, some kind of financial crisis, which then suggests to the regime that they need to engage in reforms. Those reforms have unintended consequences, which either weaken the state or they create a split within the regime. The split within the regime then causes some people to defect from the regime. That weakens the regime, weakens the state, and then the opposition becomes strong. And so what happens at a certain point, you have a revolutionary situation, right? You have a situation where groups in society, or if it's a revolution from above within the state, who want to create a completely different form of rule, or a significantly different form of rule, that is changed from a democracy, from an authoritarian regime to a democracy, or a totalitarian regime to a democracy, or from a democracy to authoritarian regime in theory, for example, like the Hitler regime, essentially. And for the revolutionary movement to succeed, its resources need to be, and its overall strength need to be somewhat comparable to those of the ruling groups in the state, right? Yeah. Or the ruling groups is revolution from above, the revolutionaries and the ruling groups are both in the state. So in the case of a revolution from below, the revolutionary coalition, usually in case of revolution again, you have coalitions, they need to have effective leaders. Again, I mentioned these things before. Effective leaders, sufficient resources, effective propaganda, a marketable idea that answers certain questions and seems to be an answer to society's problems, effective recruitment, right? Mm-hmm. Resources to support the recruits, something for the recruits to do to further the revolution, right? So then what happens is if you have that kind of situation, then the ball sort of goes into the regime's court, right? because you'll have a fairly viable, even vital opposition revolution movement that may be potentially able to seize power. And then the regime, who's losing support in many cases because of the regime split that I mentioned earlier, needs to come to a decision. Either we're going to continue on this path and hope the opposition can't come to power. We can negotiate with the opposition, or we can engage in a crackdown. Usually what happens is you have 2 or 3 elements within the regime. Some support a crackdown, some support continuing as usual, even though things are going badly with unintended consequences and so forth. Continue with the perestroika, for example, or rekindle, reformat the perestroika or the reforms. And another group will decide, why don't we just sit down at the table with the more moderate people in the opposition and come to an agreement and switch over to a new form of rule, right? And that would be your packet or negotiated transition. A lot of that decision-making that goes on, again, has to do with who are the stronger groups within the regime, right? Within the regime-ruling groups. If the soft-liners who want to negotiate are now dwindling down to a very weak handful, and they don't have control of the organs of coercion, the secret police, the military, and so forth and so on, then there's a very grave risk that they're not going to be able to hold on to power, and hardliners who want to revert, who want to crack down, or maybe someone in coalition with those who just want to continue either fake reforms or watered down reforms, may attempt to just crack down on both the opposition and the softliners. That's what we saw in the August coup, in the August 1991 coup, right? Hardliners moved against both Gorbachev and Yeltsin in order to put an end to perestroika, because Gorbachev at the time was engaging in a process of pacting. He was pact-making with the opposition. And the plan was that in the fall of 1991, they were going to, already in August 1991, they were going to sign the Union Treaty. In the Union Treaty, the text that was in the Union Treaty and would be used in the Constitution was that they were going to create a full democracy, right, with universal suffrage, no set-aside seats for the Communist Party, as was created by Gorbachev earlier during the perestroika period. Full access to media, a complete democratic transition. He was going to split the Communist Party into groups, severing, basically kicking out the hardliners and keeping a moderate party for himself. He was going to run for president. Yeltsin probably would have run for president too. And that was one of the reasons why the coup occurred, because they saw in the text of the Union Treaty a full transition to democracy, plus the fact that Gorbachev was apparently willing to let 6 or 7 or 8 Union republics leave the Soviet Union. Mm-hmm. So you put all that together, and that sparked the coup. So, it's a very complicated issue. There are economic, social, political factors that go into the deciding, right, whether the dynamics of the revolutionary situation are going to go into a transition or into a revolution. And then, in terms of if it's going to be a revolution, it depends on if there are opposition forces in society or the state who are the most powerful who get. Revolution from above are fairly rare things. There are only maybe 7 or 8 cases of revolution from above that I know of. And so they're fairly rare compared to revolution from below, but they do occur, and they occurred, in my view, one occurred in 1991 in Russia. So,
what were maybe 2 or 3 other examples you can think of?
The Meiji takeover in Japan in the early mid 19th century. Ataturk's Turkey, for example. Some argue that the takeover of power by Nasser in Egypt and the switch over from a more religious regime to a more secular regime. Also, one could argue, for example, that the takeover of the Assads in Syria was a revolution from above. Also, Saddam Hussein in Iraq, in which they switched over from sort of monarchical type of rule to what's called sort of Arab nationalism or Arab national socialist regimes, sort of the Ba'athist ideology. Those are the most prominent cases. Also, there may be a few, for example, the Peruvian military takeover in the 50s or 60s, I believe it was. So,
okay.
there are some cases, but revolution from below is much more widespread.
Well, and if we look at revolutions from below, you mentioned that they can be either peaceful or violent. One of the features that kind of strikes me about, well, when I picture kind of like the perfect storm, the perfect revolutionary storm where it kind of, everything that can happen does happen, the way I see it is like it's not just a regime change. It's not just that the people running the government get replaced, but there's a total restructuring of pretty much the entire social structure, from the level of the village to the very top levels of power. Right. And have you looked at that at all? Do you what might contribute to that direction as opposed to, let's say, a peaceful revolution where things pretty much kind of, many of the structures kind of stay the same, but there is a visible and real change in the regime.
Mm-hmm. So you're talking about socioeconomic change as opposed to political transformation.
Yeah.
Well, in most cases, it involves both. It's not just the political change is undertaken to facilitate socioeconomic change.
Yeah.
So either if you have a Soviet regime, right, which was totalitarian and the state owned everything, part of the new ideology of the revolutionaries and even some of the reformers, right, was a capitalist model, right? And even Gorbachev, who was very reluctant to move to a full capitalist model, still wanted to engage in a major privatization by the time, August 1991 began. And he even toyed with that in the fall of 1990 when he was negotiating with Yeltsin over the 500 days program. So that's one case, right, is when you move from entirely state-owned to a more capitalist model. And then, of course, we have the cases of the Marxist revolutions where in a capitalist society or where there's a grossly disproportionate distribution of wealth, combined with political repression, which they usually go hand in hand. Marxists came to power, and they wanted to do quite the opposite. They wanted to take the property away from the upper classes and give it to the lower classes. The problem is they didn't have a mechanism to ensure that dictatorship would not emerge in the process of doing that. And there simply becomes, and it's hard to imagine a process whereby you can do that, right?
Yeah.
It's very difficult. And so in most cases, these things are tied, although one can argue, for example, if you look at the revolutions from above, for example, the socioeconomic, one of the aspects of revolution from above compared to revolution from below is that there's actually less change in a revolution from above, and that's because, as I argued in the book, and for example, Trimberger, who wrote about the Meiji revolution, or, she called it revolution from above, one aspect is that the change was less dramatic. So, in a sense, we're seeing that now, say, in post-Soviet Russia, right? Rather than seeing, a really vibrant democracy, democracy also, but a vibrant economy with, a large percentage of the economy being driven by small businesses, as in the West, and overwhelming majority of business and economic activity occurring outside the state. What we're seeing is, in fact, that in Russia you still have 50% or more of the economic activity under the control of the state, and a good part of the rest of it is under pressure from the state, if not when not direct control. So, in this sense, there was minimal change, and one of the reasons is because in the revolution from above, there's not a complete changeover in the ruling class. What happens is because you have the revolution occurring, being made by elements within the state, you have people from the old regime, right? And they may have less of a commitment to an overhaul of the old regime. They may have less of a concrete vision about what the new regime should look like. For example, in the most obvious case, right, if you've been someone who's educated in a Marxist system with intense censorship, you're not going to have a very good idea of how a capitalist economy works, right? So you had all these guys who maybe wanted to create something they called a capitalist system because when they traveled abroad, they saw how wealthy and how well-to-do even the lower middle class was in a capitalist society. They didn't know exactly how that society functions, no less know how to move from a highly centralized state economy to that system. In fact, capitalists didn't know how to do that, and that was one of the problems of the transition, is that no one knew how to do that. So
well, let's just try it anyways and see what happens.
Right, and then plus there was pressure, right, to do it as quickly as possible from the West, which created a lot of serious problems with, in the case of Russia, minimal economic support. You know, the irony was that in the post-communist period, the much smaller countries that had a shorter period of time under communist rule, and in many cases the communist rule there was, in terms of economic management, was less centralized than it was in the Soviet Union. They received a good deal of economic assistance. Yet the problems facing them were much less formidable. Whereas in the Soviet Union, the former Soviet Union, most importantly Russia, the largest country with the most all sorts of problems connected with the Soviet past, there was very little economic assistance, relatively speaking, and at the same time, pressure to move as quickly as possible. And that created all sorts of problems, political and economic.
Well, speaking of political and economic problems, your next book is the one on Ukraine. First of all, can you tell us when is that book going to be out? Do you have a release date yet?
I heard that from the publisher about a month ago that I could not expect the page proofs earlier than 2 months from now. So maybe in 5 or 6 weeks I might get the page proofs, maybe longer. But hopefully it'll be out. My guess is it'll be out somewhere in late summer. Okay, good. Well, yeah, I'm looking forward to it. But maybe we could talk a little bit about Ukraine, because there we have another example of regime change. Of course, the Maidan. What has it been, like 3 years now? 2014?
2014, I believe, yeah.
So 3 years of anniversary of the takeover,
yeah. Can you tell us? Can you kind of take us through that, kind of using the model that we've been talking about for the first part of the show? How does this kind of what were the various factors that went into the Maidan, and where is Ukraine now, and where's it going from there? Right. The problem, I don't think the revolutionary model works very well for Ukraine, and the reason is that even under Yanukovych, although there was massive corruption, elections were more or less free and fair. That is, the power changed hands between different groups 2 or 3 times. When I say with more or less free and fair, what I mean is both sides had equal opportunity to cheat. and those who cheated more effectively and won the most support would win the elections. So again, you could say it was basically a minimally democratic regime, right? A very weak democratic regime, if you use the minimal definition of democracy, and that being fairly more or less free and fair elections. And there was free independent media under Yanukovych and so forth and so on, and in the administrations before him. So and if you look at the situation now, you're seeing that basically there's pressure on the free media, independent media in Ukraine. Elections are as dirty as they were under Yanukovych. There's pressure against the opposition, repression in some cases. So, in terms of the political regime, nothing has changed. There's been no real improvement. Corruption. 2 reports. One, I think the most recent one came out from Transparency International. Ukraine is actually worse in terms of the level of corruption than it was when Yanukovych fell from power. A new survey put out by another group, it's not actually a measure of corruption, but it's rather a measure of perceptions of corruption, rated Ukraine the most corrupt country in the world. Just came out recently. So on the measurement of corruption also, nothing has changed. If anything, things have gotten a little worse. In terms of property, there has been no major handover of property from one class to another or one group from another, other than
if you count, the repression of certain oligarchs who were tied to Yanukovych and the handover of their property to oligarchs who are close to Poroshenko. One of those oligarchs happens to be Poroshenko himself, who has not even divested himself of his properties, even though he promised to do that during the presidential campaign. So, in my view, we can't really talk about a regime change as a result of the Maidan revolution. Now, if over the next 5 or 10 years we were to see, an end to repression and discrimination against the opposition parties and against ethnic Russians, if we were to see corruption wiped out, and we began to see at least some more economic or efficient and more distributive ownership of the wealth, then maybe we could say, yeah, there was a revolution. It just took a long time to be implemented. But there are problems with that, in that there are forces within Ukraine that are not just simply corrupt and weakly committed to democratic governance. There are forces that are outright ultra-nationalist and totalitarian who are united with the powers that be at present, and at the same time are seeking to overthrow it. So then here we're talking about the ultra-nationalists like Right Sector and Svoboda Party and a host of other smaller parties, and the Radical Party of Oleg Lashko, and so there are some real problems. So we may be looking at something like the first phase of a revolution, right? With the second phase still to come, in which ultra-nationalists come to power, and it may affect a real revolutionary takeover, but one that goes in the wrong direction.
So I guess, well, to me, it kind of looks like what happened is it was regime change only in the sense of, we want to take out this guy in power that we don't like, and then just illegally put in another guy that is worse in some ways, just as bad, or in others. Then basically it was just a change in face that was illegal and violent, and there was this kind of
Right.
pseudo-revolutionary thing going on at the Maidan, but really there was no kind of change in the actual structure of government, the way things work. In fact, things just kind of got worse, which you'd kind of expect when you look at the kind of people that they decided to put into power. And then there's another factor, and that is the kind of the foreign factor, and that's the support that these the new team got from foreign governments like the U.S.
Right.
And even it still strikes me as almost, well, it should be hard to believe, even though it isn't. Like the image of before the actual change in power, before the Yanukovych was actually officially ousted, was to see American politicians, on the streets in Ukraine, doing these sorts of things and giving support to this so-called opposition. When can you imagine that kind of thing, let's say, happening in the U.S., where you have foreign leaders, members of foreign governments, on the streets of New York,
Right.
Imagine Putin coming to New York and being like, let's get rid of Hillary Clinton. If Hillary Clinton was, became president, it would be like we'd entered into a bizarro world, and yet it happens just, no questions. It's like,
Might makes right. Might makes right.
Yeah. I mean, there were a couple of comments on everything you said. I mean, first about it wasn't really a pseudo-revolution at the beginning. I mean, at the beginning, it really was the middle class and mothers with kids and grandmothers and grandfathers and fathers who wanted to see an end to corruption. They wanted to be part of the European Union because they thought that would be the way to end corruption and also to become better off economically. Right? And so that implied, right, that there would be a redistribution of economic power because the oligarchs would be weakened and economic wealth would trickle down, to use an American phrase from American politics, right? And they also wanted, and corruption involved both economic corruption and political corruption, right? The election results that they saw didn't seem to be fair, so they wanted free. So in that case, you were talking about really a quasi-revolutionary movement that could have become fully revolutionary, a peaceful revolution from below, for example.
Mm-hmm.
Problem was that these ultranationalists then began to flood in from Lvov and other places, Volyn and other places in Ukraine, where they have not strongholds, but there are larger numbers of them. And they began to arm themselves and arm the Maidan against the regime, and initiated many of the cases of the first violence that occurred. And actually, they were the ones who were behind the so-called Snipers Massacre on 2014 that scuttled the agreement between European Union and Russia and the Ukrainian opposition and Yanukovych about a transition, a pacted transition, in fact, that had been agreed upon on 20th February. And they scuttled that agreement, and then without blinking an eye, the United States backed the takeover. So that was the problem. So initially there was potential, I think, and that potential still is there, and that some of those people, representatives of those people who wanted to see an end to corruption and wanted to see a more vibrant democracy and so forth and so on, some of those people are in power. There's no doubt about it. Some of them. But they're not the strongest elements. The strongest elements are the oligarchs and the ultranationalists and corrupt elements and so forth. And criminal elements. So that's the problem. In terms of, interference in foreign elections and so forth, I mean, one classic case, I can't remember who wrote it. It might have been me, it might have been somebody else, but somebody conjectured, what if Zhirinovsky came to Ferguson, right? Something like this, right? Of course, that wouldn't happen because Zhirinovsky himself is a racist, but that's another issue. But if Zhirinovsky were to come to something like, well, for example, if Zhirinovsky were to come to occupy Wall Street, for example, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or a senator, well, he's a deputy in the Duma, so he's similar to a deputy. He's like a congressman. So, and maybe the ambassador of from Russia to the United States, and they walked around to occupy Wall Street and encourage the people to stay there and so forth. But it's actually even more complicated. It's even more complicated than that, because imagine the scenario if, in fact, the Russians had been financing different groups who ended up on Occupy Wall Street, which was precisely what was happening in the years leading up to not just the second Maidan revolution, but the first one, the so-called Orange Revolution. Mm-hmm. In fact, we were financing all sorts of groups, and the idea was to institute regime change, or regime transformation, to promote democracy, as we call it. But the problem here is that this democracy promotion instrument is a very dull instrument. We cannot control the forces that receive our funding. We can't even necessarily control the forces that receive the funding. That is, who gets the funding, right? Because the funding might go to one group, but that funding might get passed on to another group. One group might pretend to be a democratic organization, but in fact they're an ultranationalist organization.
Yeah.
Plus, there was all sorts of official involvement by the United States in terms of creating these huge networks of people who received funding from various U.S. government-connected foundations and so forth and so on. The classic case is, now I'm forgetting her last name. I wrote about it in the book, but I forget her last name. But the woman who worked in the State Department, and then she became Minister of Finances of Ukraine after the revolution. And she actually left the State Department. She at one point, I believe, worked in the U.S. Embassy in Kiev. She also worked at the State Department. Then after she left the State Department, she received a grant from the U.S. government. And then she went to Ukraine and opened up a huge foundation, and her husband began to invest money in different businesses, in other foundations, and they created a huge network of people who then went to different seminars on how to demonstrate and so forth and so on. So we basically funded people who would be ready to engage in revolutionary activity if and when that occurred. And so then you add on the fact that once that begins, then Senator McCain and I think it was Congressman Smith who showed up, and the U.S. ambassador and Ukraine, and Secretary Nuland handing out cookies, going on the square, and supporting the very people who had already received money from them, or some of them, right? Not all the grandmas and moms on the square received money, but the organizations who mobilized them, some of them or many of them, and who were organizing the whole operation, the stage and the whole operation, they had received funding, right? And then you add on top of on that fact, and then you get to the point, then you get to the issue of unmanageability of the process, right? Okay, so you recreate people who want democracy. Then an event occurs and they go out in the square and they start to demonstrate. Okay, fine. Peaceful revolution from below, I'm all for it. The idea is to create democracy and get rid of corruption, fine, as long as it remains peaceful. Problem is you can't control the process because revolutionary movements, again, are coalitions, and they can be wide-ranging coalitions in terms of ideology. So again, what you had was the Svoboda Party being part of the coalition. It's an ultra-nationalist, anti-Semitic party, side by side with more democratic parties or quasi-democratic parties. And then you had the formation on the second or third night of the Maidan on the square itself of Right Sector, which was another Svoboda-type party, a neo-fascist party, based on another group called the Ukrainian National Assembly, which is also basically a neo-Nazi party with symbolics that are Nazi-like and an ideology that's radically totalitarian and imperialist and so forth. And these people are the ones who organized the violence on the Maidan. These are the ones who organized the snipers' attacks on the police and on demonstrators, simultaneously shooting at demonstrators and police on the night of February 19th and on February 20th that led to the revolt and led to the violation of the agreement that had been signed by the European Union, Russia, Ukrainian opposition, and Yanukovych. So it's much more serious than simply a couple of officials appearing on the square, though that's serious enough. But it's what happened before and then what happened after. You know, so you can basically say that it was a U.S.-backed takeover.
Yep.
You know, even if the original intention was not to have something like that which occurred occur. But once it occurred, we didn't oppose it.
Yep.
So that's the key point.
Well, for all these years, those neo-Nazi groups have been protesting against Poroshenko and causing riots and running like mad, starting gunfights with the army and
right.
and just causing chaos. But I was wondering, have they increased in their political power, or are they more like just a gang that's maybe used by certain oligarchs now and then to keep pressure on Poroshenko or to advance whatever goals they have? But are they advancing in political power? Do they have? I mean, would we see another Maidan attempt in the future on their part, like they've promised in the past?
I think that at some point we could see that. It depends again on one of the things that makes one at least partially be able to understand why the West continues to support Poroshenko is that if they don't support Poroshenko, and I mean financially and morally and so forth and politically, is that these characters could very well come to power. That is the problem. I don't know. I can't say for sure that they've increased their strength, but they certainly have not lost any strength. And so if you look at the numbers of deputies, and it's a trickier thing than simply looking at the parties represented in the Rada, because some of the people who are members of neo-Nazi and neo-fascist parties became members of other groups that are less radical, but they have a seat in the Rada, and so they're still potentially a problem. And then, of course, parties outside the Rada that didn't get elected, like Right Sector and the Svoboda Party. In the past, Svoboda Party has been elected, and they've actually received large minorities in certain areas, like Ternopil. I think they received like 30% of the assembly in the region of Ternopil a few years back. So these are forces that are definitely, forces that need to be dealt with in one way or another, and potentially could come to power. You don't. Altogether, probably the number of neo-fascist and ultra-nationalist deputies in the Rada is probably something like 30%, but there are other people who are willing to vote along with them in blocks. And so it's a dangerous situation. And the longer the economy continues to deteriorate or at least stagnate, if at some point the West withdrew its support for Ukraine, and I think this is one of the things that stood behind the recent vote in the European Union to give at least short-term visa-free status of Ukrainians into Europe, is because they understand. They don't understand that well, maybe they do understand that they created the problem, but now that there is a problem, they understand that if they take the foot off the pedal of support for Poroshenko, that the whole thing could come tumbling down. And so we're really sort of caught in a quagmire in which we need to keep pouring money down this sinkhole that doesn't seem to have many prospects for becoming less corrupt and any more democratic. And then, of course, we haven't even talked about what's going on in Donbass and so forth, which is another factor that makes it more difficult to engage. We have to be honest. It makes, the fact that there's still what's the word I'm looking for? Slowly boiling war in the Donbass makes it less easier to engage in reform, even if people in Kiev actually do want to engage in the reform. Mm-hmm. So you add the Donbass war onto the problem, and it's it's very formidable.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's hard to know what to take from this, but there was a recent report. I can't remember if it was originally in the Daily Mail or where, but that Secretary of State Tillerson had a conversation. I believe it was with an Italian minister or something, where they were talking about Ukraine, and Tillerson said, "Well, why do the American taxpayers care about Ukraine? Like, what difference does it make to them?" Implying at least that that Ukraine isn't really a priority for us. Of course, you get contradictory statements coming out of the Trump administration on issues like left and right, so it's hard to know what to take from that. But any way you look at it, it's like Ukraine isn't really can't really look forward to too much, let's say, hope or chance for good things to happen. It looks like any way you look at it, there's a disaster coming in one way or another.
Very, very possibly. And the comment made allegedly by Tillerson, I saw that quote. I didn't have time to check to verify whether the source was reliable, but it seemed like it was. But it points to a larger question, right? And that is, the whole, the logic behind supporting a potentially revolutionary set of forces in Ukraine, people historically close to Russia, on Russia's border, on the background of which stands the certainty that if Ukraine turns west and becomes a member of the European Union, then they become a member of NATO. Mm-hmm. So it becomes a key security question for Russia. On that background, doesn't make any sense, given that the American people, compared to the Russian people, care much less about Ukraine. And American leaders as a whole and Russian leaders as a whole have a completely different scale in terms of interest when you're talking about Ukraine. For Russians, whether it's the elite or the people, Ukraine is important. Almost every family has someone close who lives in Ukraine. Many families in Russia. Or friends who have people, or they have friends in Ukraine, or they have relatives who have friends who have relatives in Ukraine, and so forth. People used to go to vacation in Ukraine from Russia. Large numbers, I believe the figure is something like, if I'm not mistaken, 3 or 4 million Ukrainians who work in Russia, and they send money back to Ukraine. So these two countries are very deeply intertwined. At least they were. If you take Donbass and Crimea out of Ukraine, then it's not so much so. Although there are still close ties between, Russia and places like Kharkiv, or Kharkov as the Russians call it, Kharkiv as the Ukrainians call it, and other places in Odessa, for example, and other places in Ukraine. Whereas Americans, the only group that's interested in what's in Ukraine is the Ukrainian diaspora. And people like Yarishko was the woman, I think was her last name, who was the Minister of Finances and used to work in the State Department.
Yeah,
so,
but even there, like the diaspora is pretty vocal.
Yeah.
And like I'm Canadian, and we now have in Canada like a totally, well, a foreign minister that is totally, seems to be pretty much the mouthpiece of the Ukrainian diaspora in Canada, and so there's that to consider. But then again, Canada pretty much just tends to, in my view, just go along with whatever the U.S. does for the most part when it comes to foreign policy decisions. So, but I just want to.
I think the Ukrainian diaspora is very well organized, and they've also, penetrated U.S. government and the State Department, and in part they did it on the backs or in tandem with the Polish diaspora, which they have ties with, and other diasporas from the communist bloc countries during the Cold War, and so they're well embedded into the system, and the Russians are not. In fact, the Russians were more tied to the center of the Soviet regime in our minds, even though Russians suffered as much from the Soviet regime as any other ethnic group, but that's another story. It's a very serious problem. But again, Americans are not going to. I can't imagine a scenario in which, if there was nothing else going on, to support a war against Russia, that they would be willing to fight a war with Russia over Ukraine. Which is not in the cards.
Well, the whole involvement of the United States in the support for some of the parties that ended up being successful in the Maidan brings us to an issue that gets into this regime change kind of whole scenario, revolutionary scenario that we've been talking about, and that seems to be a kind of how should I call it, like a foreign weaponization of regime change in other nations. So that's where, so we have these processes that can be completely homegrown, strictly local. This can be revolutions from below or just, transitions or revolutions from above that are strictly, dealing with the country in question. But now we have to add into the equation the possibility of foreign involvement. So that would be, and I guess you could put that foreign involvement at any level in that structure too. So you could have foreign support for these grassroots movements, and where, like in Ukraine, you have people with legitimate grievances who are demonstrating and creating this revolutionary climate that is at least legitimate in the sense of they totally believe in what they're doing and want change, and then that gets hijacked by foreign elements. And when I say foreign, I mean foreign in the sense of really foreign, but actually elements, let's say Ukrainian elements, that have more in common and their goals are more aligned with the foreigners, the Americans in this case, who then hijack that revolution, and they just kind of exploit the popular support that they get. And we can see another example of that, I think, in what happened in Syria, where at the beginning of the so-called Syrian revolution, there were there were real protests, and they were peaceful protests. And then very quickly, again, we saw snipers, we saw violence break out, and then we saw the most extreme radical groups hijack this revolution. And if we're to believe some of the analysis of what was actually going on in the Syrian revolution from that very early point, again we find foreign support from numerous countries for all of these like jihadi movements, and that would be and when it started out, of course, they weren't openly self-declared jihadis or even like Muslim Brotherhood. That was all. I mean, all that kind of stuff was there, but wasn't really acknowledged, primarily in the Western media. But you had foreign governments in the Arab world, in Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Western governments supporting these violent groups and hoping for a kind of regime change, and yet and destabilization. And yet, as you mentioned just in 5 or 10 minutes ago, a situation like that is unmanageable in a certain sense. So on the one hand, it is manageable in a sense that you can get something out of it that you want, whether it's just destabilization or you use the movement to the extent that you can then put your guy in power.
Yeah.
Or there's the possibility that you just totally lose control of it, right. And there's nothing you can do to control these people. Right. Maybe, do you have anything to say on the whole Syrian question and what's been going on in Syria and, let's say, U.S. support for like jihadist elements in Syria?
Well, basically what happened in Syria, again, the beginning, as you said earlier, I mean, there were legitimate protests. Amongst those people, there weren't many Democrats, right? The democratic ideology in Syria is not very strong, right? There aren't many people in Syria who read Jefferson and or Karl Popper or whatever, right? The majority of the opposition was Muslim Brotherhood. And the Muslim Brotherhood elements from Syria have been supported by Turkey for decades. So that was really the core of the issue at the beginning. So what happened was the United States, and specifically Secretary of State Clinton, pushed for this policy was to have weapons shipped from Libya, and this is what the whole Benghazi affair was all about. Mm-hmm. They were in the process of negotiating more weapons being sent to the Syrian opposition who reported in Benghazi from Libya. And those weapons were going to elements in the opposition, again, mostly Muslim Brotherhood, but with the jihadis beginning to glom on to onto the movement because of the proximity of jihadis in Iraq and the simple ease with which people can move around the globe nowadays. And Secretary Clinton was warned by the CIA and the other intelligence services that there were large numbers of jihadis moving in, and that the result of sending weapons to Syria would likely be the strengthening of, at the time, Al-Qaeda, because at the time Islamic State really didn't exist. There was began as a wing of Al-Qaeda and then broke off. And that they could gain control of the desert areas that overlap between Syria and Iraq. They were told specifically this by the U.S. intelligence services, and they went ahead anyway. Mm-hmm. And the problem is that even though the Muslim Brotherhood is again like Hizb ut-Tahrir, a group that basically supports non-violent, certainly non-terrorist path to power. If possible, they have no qualms about allying with jihadists in order to defeat secularists, right? Mm-hmm. So you had a revolutionary coalition in Syria that was consisting of Muslim Brotherhood and increasingly jihadists, and then probably some socialist elements, maybe a handful of guys who read Jefferson, and the weapons were going to this front. And so there was no way to guarantee that these weapons weren't going to fall into the hands of jihadists. And so this is exactly what happened. Of course, then for people who are more have a more anti-American bent or are more into conspiracy theories, this became the United States definitely supported the creation of the Islamic State. Of course, this is an overstatement. Where most people see conspiracies, in fact, there's just massive incompetence and people not wanting to look the facts of the matter in the face, or were willing to take huge risks when other people's lives are at stake, not your own. And that's generally people quite often who are in power. It doesn't matter who you are. Mm-hmm. And so this is exactly what happened. And really, it's not really a classic case on the model along of Ukraine. It bears some similar marks in that we were trying to use an opposition force to further our own agenda, and also, in a sense, there are always altruistic elements in the U.S. government who are supporting these things too, and altruistic elements within American society, right? I mean, Americans deep down would like to see democracy everywhere. This is part of our political culture. The question is, how do you achieve that? Do you achieve that by creating a model that everyone admires, and with the internet now they can just simply see what America is and what it stands for, and if they want to learn how to build a movement, they can find that on the internet. They don't need to have us sending money over and operatives and so forth and so on. And let them fight their battles. And we should be simply prepared to defend ourselves and our allies and stay out of other people's business. Mm-hmm. This is the problem. It doesn't seem to me to be beneficial to the United States to be engaging in all these quasi-covert and sometimes outright covert machinations in places where we don't understand. Again, it's hard to tell what was in the mind of the Obama administration and Hillary Clinton and so forth. Whether again they decided to just risk something on the hope that it would work out. They thought they were on some kind of a roll after Libya. They were really outraged about the nature of the Assad regime. It could be a combination. Again, these things are often multi-causal, so it could be a combination of altruistic motives, power motives, career motives, making a reputation yourself, getting ready for the 26th presidential campaign. I was the one. If you're Hillary Clinton, I'm the one who organized the establishment of democracy in Egypt and Libya and Syria. Right? I mean, that would be a great campaign slogan.
Yeah, if it worked.
It didn't work out that way.
No, that whole complex causality that you're talking about, I think you really drive that home with your book. So anybody who is watching what's happening around the globe, and they're seeing all these kind of revolutionary conditions, across the Middle East, and some of it kind of stirring up in the West, and especially that in Ukraine, and attempts in Russia. It'd definitely be a good idea to check out your books here, and definitely take a read of them, because it really helps to see just how complex the whole situation is. That way you don't get caught into any sort of black and white thinking, and you can dissect what's happening.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Conspiracy theories as well. Mm-hmm. They have to avoid. It's not to say that there aren't some people engaging in conspiracies also, but
mm-hmm.
their capacity to pull them off or to pull them off the way they think they can is greatly limited.
Mm-hmm.
Basically in that way, I'm a kind of a Tolstoyan. If you've read War and Peace, right? And the whole idea of Tolstoy's War and Peace was, right, these great leaders think that they actually control the destinies of peoples and they control the course of history, but in fact they just set things in motion that they can't simply control. And quite often they just end up being destroyed by the things that they set in motion. So,
mm-hmm. Well, do we want to go in any other directions, or?
I thought that was a really good ending quote there.
Okay. All right. Well, then, Gordon, I think we'll end it there for today. So, thanks again for being on. We had a great time.
Yeah, thank you so
talking
much.
With you.
Thank you very much, and I had a great time. It was a lot of fun.
Okay. Well, we'll keep in touch. So, everyone, stay tuned. We'll be back next week. And again, if you want to read Gordon's work, you can go to gordonhahn.com. That's Hahn.
See you next week, everybody.